everybody from around the world. I always love this. I just love it so much. And we're live streaming now as well. So I got an email from my friend Minda Dentler, and if you haven't seen her TED Talk, you should see it. She was the first, and so far as I know, the only wheelchair athlete to finish the Ironman Kona. And she said to me, I just met somebody that I think you should talk to. And so I contacted Jacqueline James up at the University of Minnesota, and we made a date to speak last week. And I found it absolutely inspiring and shocking that somebody this young was already involved in collecting data on our group, our aging group. So I asked her if she would speak today, and she is here online with us, and I'm going to introduce her. Where is Jacqueline? Would you say hello, please?
Hi, I'm right here.
There she is. Now I have you on my screen as well. And so the first thing that I wanted to ask Jacqueline was for her to introduce herself and tell us how she became interested first in polio and now in post-polio syndrome. So take it away, Jackie.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Jacqueline. You can call me Jackie, though. And I am a fifth-year Ph.D. candidate at the University of Minnesota. And I also got my master's degree here. So I am in the rhetoric and technical communication program. So I study kind of communication systems and the ways that kind of language can tell us a lot about how power systems work, or how tell us about doctor-patient relationships, or tell us about who's valued in a certain space. And when I came to the University of Minnesota, I was always really interested in aging and elder care. So that's what I was working on when I first came here, and I became really interested in the history of medicine. So I started taking some classes in the history of medicine because I wanted to understand how the American healthcare system thought about its aging population over really like the 19th and 20th centuries. And I had a professor who was encouraging me to start looking at archives and start, finding out what I could. And I was kind of lost on it. And she brought up a few things that I could focus on. And one of them was polio. And she explained to me that in Minneapolis, there were many cases of polio through the 1930s, and then some of the highest spikes of polio cases in the 1940s and early 1950s, right before the vaccine. And so she told me that the archives here are really, really world-class as far as, cataloging polio cases, treatment methods. Also, Sister Elizabeth Kenny had her first hospital in the US was based in Minneapolis, and it's still ongoing. It's the Elizabeth Kenny Institute. And so I went ahead and started looking at what the archives had about polio, and I became very interested in it. The history of polio is just so rich, and there's so much to it. So I became really interested in Sister Kenny and her method, and kind of her story as a figure of pioneering a certain type of treatment, and her real advocacy for polio patients. So that was my master's thesis, was about Sister Kenny and how she developed her treatment. But something that really interested me while I was studying Sister Kenny in the archives was what I was noticing. I was noticing a lot of notes from doctors. I noticed a lot of funding documents from the NFIP, the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, or I noticed a lot of funding from different, like the March of Dimes, but there were things that I didn't see. So for example, I really didn't see a lot of polio patients' actual voices in the archive. I didn't really see anything like that. I also didn't see really any records of any African American patients at all, which was interesting because it's not that Black people never got polio or never do have polio. And I also noticed as we got up to the vaccine, the archival records about polio patients just really disappeared. Like there was no more, there was very little. It was like a lot of polio materials, and then it really dropped off in 1955. So I was curious about that. I was like, okay, a vaccine was developed, and that's great. But all of these people who had polio didn't just like disappear, or they weren't really cured, right? There are all these patients who are still living with their disease. So that really piqued my interest. I was like, what happened with that? So that's how I started researching post-polio. I was curious, you know, what happened to these patients? And I learned about post-polio. And then I got really interested in why that isn't really cataloged in archives. And I started thinking, how can I fill that gap myself? And the answer to that is talking to people who have polio and learning about their experience and how they came to their diagnosis. And I've become pretty invested in it over the last 5 or 6 years. So that's kind of like a high level how I got into studying polio and post-polio. So yeah.
And so when you collect data right now, and you're in the, are you in an early stage of data collection? Are you in the middle? Where are you in how you're thinking about this collection?
Yeah, I would say I'm like in the middle. I spent like about 2 years looking at archival data. Part of that was in my master's thesis, and then I kept on looking at archival, what is in the Minnesota Historical Archive, what is in the University of Minnesota archives. I also have looked at digital archives from the Disability Museum, and also Harvard and the Smithsonian have some digitized archives. So I've spent a good amount of time looking at archival data. And then I shifted into a second phase of research, which is interviewing people with polio. So I'm kind of in the middle of that phase. Once I finish my interviews with polio patients, then I might go back and look at the archives again and see if those interviews kind of shifted my perspective or helped me notice anything that I didn't notice before.
So in that original archival search for this part of your work, did you find post-polio syndrome information in places like that, in the Disability Museum, in the Smithsonian? Do you find it anywhere?
There are like mentions of post-polio syndrome, like mentions. So it's not that it's totally absent, but there's not really like a robust cataloging of information. Like there's not the same depth of documents that you would expect to see, like funding proposals for care, or meeting minutes from physicians and like stakeholders talking about post-polio syndrome. That's not really something that I've found. Most of the writing I found about post-polio in the archives is really about from social welfare policymakers, and they're mostly having anxiety about not only do we have an aging population in the US, but we also have all of these people who might have post-polio syndrome. So kind of thinking about people with post-polio as like a policy problem, and less like, or so like an impending issue, rather than cataloging their, like how that diagnosis came to be or formed, is really something that I was initially interested in. And then I found that I couldn't really find that information, like who really, records of who the doctors who were thinking about that, or the patients who were thinking about that, aren't really there, I would say, at least in what I've seen. I haven't looked at literally every archive in the world. That would take my entire life, but I've looked at the good ones.
Right, and because you're really focusing on just the United States, so you must now notice that the population that you're interviewing is an older population. It's an aging population.
Yes.
And do you, when you talk to people, and I'm certainly not asking you to reveal your data, do you find any through lines? Do you find that there's certain similarities that you were surprised to find, or not at all surprised to find?
Can you repeat? I just got distracted by the chat. Somebody's question just popped up for me. Can you repeat your question, Anna?
Sure. When you are in the midst of your oral histories with people, Do you
Uh-huh.
find that there is a through line, that there are similarities or no similarities, or when you hear some stories, do you think to yourself, oh yeah, I've heard this one before, this is very common, this is what I need to expect this more than from some people?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there are a lot of similarities between kind of the life challenges and that people with polio experience, that I've noticed. And I also have noticed um, kind of similar ways of thinking about just like the role that polio is going to play in someone's life, or their approach to um, maintaining like a certain level of health or mobility over the course of their life. So that's something I've definitely noticed. I also have noticed a lot of similarities in the way people come to realize that they have post-polio syndrome, or that that's something that they should be aware of in their own life. And I've also the strongest similarity, honestly, is when people start to suspect that there's something going on in their bodies when they're older, um, and they start to think, what's going on with me? Does it have something to do with my childhood polio? Um, there's a really similar process of kind of negotiating that diagnosis with themselves, and then also trying to find a doctor who's going to listen and who's going to know anything about post polio. I think that's a challenge. A lot of patients have talked about how they can't find a doctor, or they've only been able to find a healthcare team through luck. Like, so it just so happens that a nurse that was treating them had an uncle who had polio. And so she knows a little bit more about polio treatment. And that's just through luck that they arrived at that physician or that nurse. And often it's not really like medical school training that
Mhm.
acquainted that doctor with, or nurse with polio and how to treat polio and how to listen to a polio patient, but it's more like, oh, I had a family member who had polio, and that's why I know how to think about this with you, or why I'm taking it seriously, or even bringing it up as a potential diagnosis.
Because you specialize in communication and you have been interested in elder care,
Mhm.
um, how do people talk about that particular struggle? Do they talk about that they feel invisible? Do they feel like they have a hidden disability? Tell me what you feel when you talk to people and you hear their stories about that.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, I've heard from a lot of polio patients that they often feel very isolated the older that they get, so that they don't, I've heard from, participants saying that either they don't want to feel like a burden on their family, so they kind of withdraw, or try not to ask so many favors of their family members, or they just are spending so much of their energy on trying to find a doctor that will help them out, that they don't have the energy to do other things with their life, or their time. So that kind of contributes to a feeling of isolation. I think um, there's a sense of frustration there that I hear from polio patients. Not from every person,
Of course.
but from quite a few people. I think feel isolated and feel a little frustrated with that, and maybe don't feel kind of scared about what they're going to do as they continue to age and potentially their post polio symptoms worsen. So, yeah.
Hmm. Um, I have heard from the polio survivors that I know
Mhm.
that they felt discriminated against.
Mhm.
Um, do you find, did they talk about that in terms of childhood or workplace when they were growing up? I mean, being a disabled child is tough on any child going to
Mhm.
school. And so I was always discriminated in ways in school.
Mhm.
But then as I got older, it was definitely in the workplace as well. Is that something that you talk about or ask about?
Yeah, when I ask about when a patient or a participant started noticing like maybe notice that they're different than other children or something in childhood. I have heard from polio patients, especially when they're young, feeling different, feeling different than their own family members, and even having a difficult relationship with their siblings because of that, or having kind of a pretty rough experience in school. Some of the older polio patients that I've talked to are, especially if they lived in a rural area, were just homeschooled, just didn't go to school with the other kids. And so that seems like that was on a pretty common experience for the upper range of age of polio patients. Yeah. But yeah, I do hear that from polio patients. Also, kind of this strategizing, like, what can I do? So what's a career I can have that where I won't have to experience that kind of discrimination, or I can try and protect myself from that in some way, to varying degrees of success, I think. But I think everybody's looking for a sense of control over their future. So how can I, land in a spot where I can be at my strongest? And yeah.
And so tell me where you think you are in your data collection that will lead you to some conclusions.
Well, I think I already have some good, interesting themes that are rising out of my interviews, especially. And it makes me excited to look back at the art, just so many photos of documents that I've taken. So many archival data points. So it makes me excited. My interviews make me excited to look back at what I collected from the archives, because I think it'll offer me a fresh perspective on some of those texts that I found, which sometimes are very minutiae, they're very, can be honestly very boring and very technical documents. And sometimes they make your eyes cross when you're looking at them for a long time. But I think when they're put in context, in the context of what present day polio patients are saying, I think I'm really excited to see, how my perspective changes on some of those maybe funding documents or something like that. So yeah, I don't know exactly how to answer your question. I think I'm definitely, themes are rising from the data. And I think as I interview polio patients more, I get a kind of sharper sense for the salient aspects of and common aspects of the polio experience. And so I'm kind of still trying to reach a point of saturation on that. So still trying to interview more people, basically. Yeah.
Many people that join us have a sense of hopelessness because they feel that isolation. Do you feel hopeful about what your results or change of perspective or writing will do? Do you feel hopeful that something will change or be advanced?
Yeah, I do. I think that people, so the general public, I think as a block, everybody's interested in their own experience in their own life. And I think that people like to forget about uncomfortable things, especially epidemics, because they're scary. People wanted to forget about polio once the vaccine came out. They were like, poof, great, polio's over, great American triumph. We did it. We made a vaccine. And then, everybody kind of wants to move forward and forget about it. And the same thing happened with the AIDS epidemic as well. And I think because of COVID and how widespread it is and how ongoing it is, people started looking back at history and thinking, academics did, policymakers did, and I think just, you can even, post-polio was written about in the New York Times. People were like, oh, okay, what's going on with this? What happens after an epidemic? What can we expect for ourselves? And I think, that might come out of a place of self-interest of everybody, but I also think it does raise awareness, honestly, about post-polio, about polio, about, that people who contracted disease as a result of a pandemic or an epidemic are people, and they're still around. And just because, one person got vaccinated doesn't mean that another person isn't sick, or isn't dealing with, the long-term consequences of an infection. So I think that I am hopeful. Yes, I think that already I hear people, when I first started this project, this was like pre-COVID, people were like shocked that people with polio were still alive. Like people in my age group, I'm in my mid-20s, were like, oh, they were truly floored when I was like, oh, and I'm planning on interviewing people with polio. Truly floored when I said that. And we're like, how would you do that? Are they like 100? And I was like, no, they're older, but they're still around and they will be for a while. And I think now I don't get that as much from people. I think people are much more like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I read about that. I've heard about that. And they're very interested to learn more about it from me. So I'm hopeful. I think that, my project is just one amongst, hopefully, I think there's kind of a crop of research that's coming out right now about polio, to be honest. So I think I'm one of like a small cohort of younger people who are interested. So I think that there's going to be some sustained interest. And I think, hopefully my project just helps shed light on kind of the historical aspect of polio and how people are thinking about polio in the present. Like, how do present day challenges around having polio, successes around having polio, like how does the present day polio experience connect to the way polio was thought about historically? And so I'm hopeful that I'll continue to contribute to awareness about polio, and I think awareness is rising. Yeah.
The interesting thing for me when I think about the timing of all of this, and that we are coming together at a time when it is at least being talked about, I think it had a lot to do with long COVID. And when people began to see, well, you had the infection, you got your boosters, but now you're still struggling years later, it helps put us into a frame. We're saying, yeah, you had that many years ago, but you still have something now that is causing you to have these symptoms. So I think our timing, if there has to be such a thing, for awareness is really quite extraordinary and quite good.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you want to share with us now before we get on to some questions? First of all, let me ask, if people would like to get in touch with you, can we share your information? There are people I'm sure to be interviewed, and you have a really extraordinary group. They do have to be US citizens,
Yeah, sadly,
because that's your goal right this minute. So I will make sure that if anybody wants that, we will give them your email address to write you, and you can make the appointment. You have a really good group here, I have to tell you, a really good group. You're going to learn a lot, as I have.
Yes, well, yes. So everything Ina just said, hopefully my contact information is shared with the group. I'm still looking for participants. The interviews are like an hour to 90 minutes, and I would really love to speak with you if you have any interest in sitting down with me. If you're curious about the experience, not to volunteer you, Ina, but I did interview Ina, so she knows how it went, and maybe she can share what it was like a little bit. But yeah, I would love to talk to anybody who's interested in reaching out to me. You all are such a resource, and I want to hear your stories, and I want to honor your experience. So, yeah.
Excellent. So we'll make sure that we put that up for you there. John, have you seen any questions that you want to share with us? John Nanny, you're muted, honey. You're muted.
Hello.
Not easy to mute you.
Okay. Please put questions in the chat, because we will not be calling personally on. Yes, from Constance, I hope you've also included the work done at Mayo Clinic and Shriners Hospital for crippled children. Both have strong histories of work with us in treatment of polio. I have had surgeries done in both groups. From Alex, Ms. James, would you explain or your term polio stakeholders, please?
Yeah. When I think I said that when I was talking about when I was looking at archival data. So when I look at the archives, I started out kind of a way back. So polio started spiking in the United States in the late 1800s. So maybe like, let's say the 1890s is when polio started up being a kind of having epidemic spikes instead of kind of like a low level, like it's always kind of brewing thing, which is what it was like through all of human history. Polio, wild polio virus, just kind of around. And not to be too long-winded about it, but basically after 1916, there was a big spike in New York City of polio. And it really created this need for some kind of public health address of that. Like there needs to be some kind of response. And out of that spike came the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, which is what infantile paralysis was the scientific name for polio early on, because they saw it mostly in infants. So all of a sudden, these like huge, very well-funded organizations kind of like rose out of the public health structure. So you have the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis and the March of Dimes, and then you have these philanthropists like Basil O'Connor, I don't know how to pronounce their name. And you have even like things like the Roosevelt Foundation starting up like Warm Springs. So there's like Rockefeller started funding vaccine development and also treatment. So when I'm talking about polio stakeholders, I'm talking about mostly those big funding organizations, because they are really like the vessel through which like doctors were funded, hospitals were built, treatments were developed. So when I look at archival data, one big part of what I was looking at was all of those negotiations between those organizations and the federal government. For example, like, is the government going to fund that organization? And oftentimes those organizations had to make arguments for why it was worth it to treat polio. And there's the human perspective, like, oh, well, our fellow citizen is suffering, but that's honestly kind of secondary to arguments like, this is taking out a significant subset of our workforce, right? Okay. Like this is going to become an economic burden. So when I talk about polio stakeholders, you know, like thinking about like 1916 to like 1945, usually I'm thinking about those big funding organizations. Not that there aren't other people who have a stake in polio, but
great.
That's what I meant.
Thank you.
From Francis, are you familiar with Dr. Fernando Torres Gil? He is a polio survivor who is and was affiliated with UCLA. Aging with disabilities is an area he has studied and makes policy recommendations on.
You know, I don't know if I am, so I'm like gonna save this chat for sure, and I will look up his work.
Good.
Okay.
Thank you.
And from John McFarland from Ireland, have you come across instances of abuse, sexual and physical, while in hospitals? It comes up frequently in interviews in Europe.
You know, I haven't. I've come across family abuse, unfortunately, quite a bit of it. And some physical abuse from hospital staff, but I haven't really noticed it. I haven't really noticed a lot of sexual abuse as a theme, especially by hospital staff. Nobody's really shared that with me. That might be because people aren't comfortable with it.
That's it.
Yeah, so I haven't really heard too much of that. So it's, yeah.
Okay. From Rotary International Polio Now coordinator Stella, what is being done to sensitize medical schools to include post-polio syndrome in medical education? I'm a medical doctor, and when I graduated in 1977, there was no such topic in the medical curriculum. I got a Ph.D. in epidemiology, that too.
We got it.
One of those days at Tulane University, and even then, post-polio syndrome didn't feature among public health issues of concern.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on every medical school's curriculum, but I don't think that it's really something that's discussed with medical students beyond like a very cursory. I think it's probably mentioned. I think they don't spend a ton of time on it. I think that often what I hear from polio patients is that when they when they get a doctor who's listening to them, sometimes that doctor is like, okay, I'm going to go try and learn about post-polio and polio. So they'll go and try and study it. And there are very few, I just don't think that any, unless for some reason they have a keen interest in it and they personally go and search on it for information about it, I don't think that they're really getting it as a matter of their general curriculum.
We've had people do studies on it and saying that they get about 7 minutes in
Yeah.
medical school on polio, and usually it's just the history of polio.
Yeah.
Francis asked again, Jacqueline mentioned language and doctor-patient relations. This is a key issue for polio survivors. So often these do not go well. Have you any comments on this? Any of your themes relating to this area?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So yeah, I think what I hear from polio patients is some polio patients are willing to travel like an extraordinary distance to try and find a doctor that is going to treat them and really understand their experience and their medical history. And not, I've heard from patients that they were told, oh, you're just getting old, you know, and this is a patient who's like 45 or something and is feeling, you know, real post-polio symptoms, and they're told by a doctor, oh, you're just getting old, and honestly, sometimes recommended treatments that are detrimental, like over-exercise, stuff like that. So I've heard from patients, you know, really needed to be self-advocates. For multiple participants have showed me the card. One patient had a laminated card that she with all the facts about post-polio, and she hands it to nurses and doctors when she meets them. She has it on her person at all times because when she goes through surgery or is in a hospital, she has concerns that not everybody on her care team really understands her body and what she, you know, what the effects that polio can have, especially on anesthesia and stuff like that. So I've had multiple participants just show me a literal flyer that they hand people and their doctors to try and educate them on their, you know, what's going on with them.
Great. Chuck from Ohio, many think that Sister Kenny method was abuse. What is your opinion?
Yeah, I've heard that from some participants. You know, I get a range. Some participants were very, you know, grateful for it. I think pretty much everybody says it was very unpleasant to go through. I've also heard from patients who didn't get the Kenny method, though, that that orthodox medical treatments were very unpleasant as well. So put in a cast for like 3 years or something like that, and unable to, like, having to be carried up and down the stairs because like both legs were in a cast that didn't allow them to really make use of their muscles. So what I will say is that's a theme. People found it unpleasant, but as far as their perspective on, you know, whether or not it is abuse depends on the person. Some people felt like it was worth it and some people didn't.
I can comment on that personally. My mom did Sister Kenny's physical therapy on me, but not the hot packs because she couldn't afford the equipment to use it. I would not have walked and played sports without Sister Kenny's treatment. But my mom did. I was young. My mom did tell me that I would scream in pain when she stretched my muscles. From Jacqueline, and I disagree with this statement. How can you ensure that your efforts will be sustainable as polio could not be eradicated completely?
I am curious. Well, I guess I'm not exactly sure what the question is. So as far as like my efforts being sustainable, I think that I'm trying to bring awareness about polio and post-polio, and I'm also trying to use my position as a researcher to advocate for polio patients in you know, however I can. So I think that, you know, anything that I do or that other people who are interested in polio do, or anything that polio patients do to preserve their health and happiness, I think helps anybody with a chronic illness or a chronic disease of any kind. I think living well, advocating for yourselves, it helps other people with chronic illness, whether or not those people specifically have polio. So, you know, as far as polio being eradicated completely, I can't really speak to whether or not that'll happen. Hopefully it will. I mean, it seems they're gotten pretty close. But yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
There's been long debate on that, but Rotary in 1979 proved in the Philippines by vaccinating 6 million kids, and wiping out polio, proved that it can be eradicated. We just have to vaccinate, get into areas that wild polio still is in, and we are starting to do that in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and we're having great results.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll get there. We'll get
Yeah,
there.
we'll get, if not fully, pretty darn close, I think. So
Only I don't see anything else. I'm sorry.
All right. So Jacqueline, you're going to get the copy of this for sure. And from when you began, let's end it with this. From when you began and you had really kind of no idea of what you were getting into, where are you now? Where are you now in this? Are you surprised at what you found? Are you shocked? Are you delighted? Are you concerned? Where are you?
You know, I feel really grateful for everyone who talks with me. I want to say that it's been like a really lovely experience speaking with polio patients. Like, everybody's so generous and so willing to share their stories, and I really appreciate that. And I will say, I'm surprised by the like tenacity of polio patients and how so many of you are like living your lives and doing well. And as far as what I found in the data, some things surprised me. It surprises me how quickly everybody wanted to move on from polio after 1955. That does surprise me because there was so much literature about polio and so many national campaigns about it, and that kind of just dropped off in a way that I found really shocking and interesting. How quickly people want to forget about a tough time or something. That was really shocking to me. But I'm really impressed by just how like persistent polio patients are and how good they are advocating for themselves. I hear that from everybody, how much effort and time they put into locating doctors that are going to listen to them, and how much confidence y'all have in yourselves, I think is really surprising and something I've learned about. Because sometimes when you read about chronic illness, people will talk about just feeling completely defeated. And I definitely hear that from patients, but I also hear them talking about how, if a doctor tells them, oh, it's just old age, they don't accept that. And they go and advocate for themselves and find, fly multiple states to try and find a doctor who's going to take them seriously, or they make that flyer and really educate their caretakers. And I think that is somewhat unique to your group. I think you all have a particular perspective on your lives, and it's really been interesting learning about it. Yeah.
Because we have so many academics here, I'm wondering if there's any place that we can read your master's thesis and see how this all came to be for you.
Yeah, I can try, and I think it's in my university's database, so I can send you a link, Ina, to it.
That would be great. I think we would all like to have that. Anything else, John? You said there was some other questions?
Yeah, that was one of them. Why will it be made available? And if you can, send it to Ina or Ken, if that's at all possible. Also, why is the study limited to the United States?
Yeah, the study is limited to the United States because those are the archives I have access to, but it's also because of the Institutional Review Board. It's a research board that makes sure research is ethical. Usually they kind of, for good reason, make the research go through kind of phases. One of those phases is, for me, they were like, I was told I had to limit it to the United States. So that is just the way it is, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, I have had the most delicious time checking in with you again today. And I am delighted that you were willing to share your information with us. And we are all overwhelmed, I think, by the fact that you are the youngest person we know who cares about us. So thank you very, very much. Anybody else
you.
want to say goodbye, John?
Yeah, there's a number of comments, way too many, and all very appropriate. If you can look at those when you save the chat, that would be wonderful.
Yeah.
That's it.
I see all your comments in the chat. I've saved the chat. If you want to participate in an interview, I'm going to put my email in the chat right now. And also maybe Ina will share it at another
Yes,
point.
we
But
will. We'll get that
this
out
is-
in the newsletter. Mhm.
awesome. So this is I just dropped my email, so feel free to email me and I will get back to you about that.
Great.
Thank you all so much.
Even if we're Canadian, Jackie?
Unfortunately,
No.
No.
No, I apologize about that. I've had so many people, especially from the UK and Canada, contact me, and I just have to say I can't interview you, and I apologize about that.
Who knows? Maybe she'll get some giant funding and she'll be able to travel the world.
Maybe I will, or I can try and talk to the institute. I'll see if the IRB will grant me an exception. And if they do, I can let Ina know, and they can.
Yeah, we'll put it out
Canadians
to
welcome, but
we have some great Canadian followers here with us. Great.
yeah.
Jacqueline, this is Constance, if I may, please. One of the things I would love for you to also consider as part of your research, please look into the idea of some of that personality piece you were talking about the tenacity and the persistence of polio survivors and post-polio patients. Is there a correlation between that happening early on in life, as opposed to like with COVID being something that's now affecting more adult and elders? How that age difference, because for many of us, it's almost like we didn't know any other life other than dealing with our polio and both the physical and the mental and the emotional effects. And did that have an impact in terms of not only how we evolved as people, but also our attitudes and the way we handled the rest of our lives, both as polio survivors and post-polio survivors, later on, in terms of our advocacy, in terms of our speaking out, in terms of our not taking a back seat and hunting out the things we needed. Just a suggestion.
Yeah.
And yes, John,
I've
I
got
will
that.
shut up now. Thank you.
I've got that written down. So thank you, Constance.
Anything else, John?
No, that's it.
Okay. Well, it was a great day. We will convene back here in January. I wish everybody a new year filled with delicious surprises. And thank you all for being part of what we hope will be a remarkable global effort to raise awareness and to keep us all together.
Happy holidays.
Happy
Merry
holidays.
Christmas.
Yeah.
Merry Christmas.
Thank you, Jacqueline.
Yeah, thank you all so much.
Holidays, everyone.
Thank you
All
and
right.
goodbye.
Bye, folks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye,
Thank
all.
you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye,
Have a good week.
everyone. Bye.